Hello, my name's Marty McGowan, and I come from Staten Island, New York, which is the other forgotten borough in Staten Island. My grandparents emigrated from Mayo in 1909, my grandfather in 1912, my grandmother. They both came from Mayo, and like so many other Irish, didn't know each other over there. Met here in Manhattan and got married at St. Francis de Sales Church up in the Upper East Side. My grandmother was a chambermaid. My grandfather was a steam fitter and also a New York City fireman. When my grandparents got married, they lived in the east side of Manhattan, not too far away from where the United Nations is to like day. One of the reasons why the East 40s was such a heavily Irish neighborhood was because it was close to the stockyards where the UN is now, and the place smelt. So hence you got the Irish town in the East 40s. My grandmother, as I said, was a chambermaid. My grandfather, he eventually joined the New York City Fire Department. He was working in a firehouse in the West Side. My grandmother's best friend was also a chambermaid, and her husband was a man named John Riley, was in the New York City Fire Department, got transferred from Staten Island. This is about 1918, 1919. Well, as far as my grandmother was concerned, her best friend might as well have moved back to Ireland, because to go from Manhattan to Staten Island, just as much it is a pain in the neck now, it was just as much of a pain in the neck then. Well, my grandmother, was kind of lonesome for her best friend, and John Riley happened to be a stonemason on the side, like a lot of other guys in the fire department. They pitched in to help each other out when it comes to building things. Fire lieutenant back in Staten Island was having a house built. Everybody in the fire department pitched in. John Riley was one of the guys that helped put in the bathroom. Fire lieutenant asked John, any favor I could ask? Any favor I could do for you, John? So John says, well, if you're serious about it, my wife's best friend's husband's on the job, works in a firehouse on the West Side. Get him transferred to the island. My grandfather, Martin McGowan, was transferred within a month. Make a long story short, my grandparents, the McGowans and the Rileys, lived catty-corner to each other from about 1920 to when they died in the early 1970s. They lived in West Brighton, Staten Island, which is still a pretty heavily Irish-Italian neighborhood. A lot of things about the Irish in Staten Island. We have a pretty strong Ancient Order of Hibernians program. We have an annual parade that was conducted for many years by Marty Gillen, Ray Taylor, and Chip McLean. One of the things that we found out with regard to the Irish is there's a forgotten history on the island dating back, 50, 60 years before my grandparents came over here. Not too far away from the Staten Island Ferry, there was a quarantine station on the island that was active roughly from 1800 through 1858 when it burnt down. I'll go into the reasons why it burnt down, but in the 1840s and 1850s, a lot of the Irish came over, and there was cholera epidemics. There was epidemics of almost every shipborne disease you could think of. Now, the quarantine station did have a small cemetery in the back of its property, but by the early 1850s, that cemetery was full. What happened subsequently in the mid-1850s to the late 1850s, at the end of the day, if anybody died in a quarantine, their bodies were carted up the hill. It was like Richmond Turnpike back then. It's now Victory Boulevard. To the top of the hill, dumped in the swamp. It wasn't in 1858, people in Staten Island got so fed up with the diseases that were coming back and forth that they burnt the quarantine down. Then the American Civil War happened, a few other things happened, back and forth and up and down. The quarantine was abandoned. Those bodies that were trucked up the hill were forgotten about until the 1930s, early 1940s. Back then, the city of New York decided to build a golf course there. It's now a Silver Lake golf course, Silver Lake Reservoir. Once again, flash forward to the 1990s, and there were rumors going around back and forth about a bunch of bodies from the quarantine being buried at the golf course. There was this girl from Notre Dame Academy in Staten Island. Her name was Caitlin Tormey. Did a research paper talking to friends, relatives, the borough historian back in Staten Island at the time. And they were able to piece together that there may be between 7,000 and 9,000 bodies buried on the 18th and 17th holes in Staten Island. Through the research that people like Lynn Rogers was able to do, she's a friend of abandoned cemeteries in Staten Island. A friend of hers who has subsequently passed away, Ringo Riley, and the Ancient Order of Hibernians and a few other community groups, we were able to have a symbolic burial for the Famine Irish about 8 years ago with a ceremony at St. Peter's Church, which is located not too far away from the island. What's symbolic about this also, St. Peter's was built in the 1840s. One of its first pastors, Father Mark Murphy, died of cholera, treating the Famine Irish that passed away down at the quarantine. Now, all of these stories that I'm talking about, back and forth and up and down with regard to a lot of people, these things were buried for years and years and years. And it wasn't until the research that people are beginning to do now in the last 20 years, going back into family roots, going back into talking about, oh, you see that person over there, this story, that story, that this may be true, this might be true. Let's try to look into old newspapers. Turns out that one of the Vanderbilts, a Commodore Vanderbilt's nephew, had property that was close to where these bodies are buried. And if you go back into the archives, you can find out that John Vanderbilt was complaining about the bodies being buried close to his property in roughly 1858, right before the quarantine happened. So using research things like we're talking about here, and through the efforts of everybody connected with this fine project, go back, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to everybody you could think of, not only with regard to the Irish, but to the Italians, every immigrant group that has come over here, even the recent immigrant groups that have come over. Because one of the greatest things about this country, one of the greatest things about New York City, is the melting pot and how everybody has tremendous things to share with each other, and how my story about my grandparents isn't too much different from 1,000 other stories that are connected all over. And thank you so much for your time and trouble, and thanks for asking me to do this. I appreciate it.